I would say that EQ is probably the most important aspect of mastering. In the last video, we looked at the topic of loudness and why it's so critical. Loudness affects the way that we hear sound. Louder sounds sound brighter and bassier to us. So before we adjust anything else about the EQ or the dynamics of the music we're working on or the audio we're working on, we need to get the level right. And that was what we looked at in the previous video. And hopefully now you've got a good idea of how to do that and how loud you want to master. So now we're in a position to actually start EQing the tracks. Now that we have them at that correct loudness level, we're hearing them accurately, and the EQ decisions we make are going to be useful. We won't have to keep going around in circles, hopefully. I would say that EQ is probably the most important aspect of mastering. I guess you could say that level is even more fundamental, but I think we need to take that as a given. One of the major things that we do in mastering is getting the level of the songs right. And then EQ is the next most important thing, and it has a huge influence. Of course, when you're working on just stereo files without access to the details of the mix, you can't really lift the snare out or reduce the level of the vocal or bring the kick drum forward in the mix. The amazing thing about mastering is that you can make it seem as though you have. Now, obviously, if there's a huge change needed in the mix, it's always better to go back to the mix files themselves, back to the client if you have a client, to try and get the mix as good as it can possibly be so that there's as little to do at the mastering stage as possible. But even then, especially with a group of songs maybe that have been mixed and recorded and produced over a fair period of time, there are going to be little differences in between the songs, and evening those out, individual settings for every song is the key to mastering, and it's amazing what a profound effect such a small change can have. Now, having said that, there are times where you really roll your sleeves up and dig in with the mastering processing, maybe because the mix files can't be adjusted, or potentially because of time pressures, or just that the artist has had enough and is like, no, that's the best I'm going to get, you've got to work with it. Whatever those reasons, we're going to see in these videos the kind of changes you can make, why you might make them, and the kind of things that I'm thinking about when I'm working on the EQ of the different songs in a collection, in a compilation, an EP, a playlist, whatever. So let's dive straight into Wavelab and start taking a look at this with some practical examples. And there's not going to be time to go through the complete process of deciding the EQ for these songs in these videos. But what I'm going to do is show you each EQ move in the order that I did it when I was working on the song. And you're going to see that some of them are really quite subtle, especially the later moves. It's broad brush strokes to begin with, but then more specific and more detailed. So quite small changes often, but I think what you'll find when I bypass them all at once at the end is that they add up to something quite significant, even though individually they can be quite tricky to hear. And just to recap a point that I made right at the beginning of this series of videos, of course, in order to hear those, you're going to need monitoring that is good enough. So listen to this on the best quality monitoring you can get your hands on, or a really good pair of headphones to get the most out of it. So let's just start by listening to a bit of this track. You can see that I'm using the Master Rig plugin in Wavelab. This combines various different processes. You can choose to have limiters, compressors, EQ, and saturation, but for the time being, I'm just going to be using EQ. But that's not to say that you need a fancy mastering EQ to make big improvements to your music necessarily. In fact, that's become something of a catchphrase for me. It ain't what you use, it's the way that you use it. Up to a point, most digital EQs sound very similar and can achieve very similar results. That's not 100% true. There are emulations of pieces of analog gear and some new, very innovative EQ units coming out that do offer something different. but almost any EQ can be used to achieve the same overall result, particularly where the goal is to be clean and transparent. So I'll be using Master Rig in this case, but you can use whatever EQ you have available. One nice thing is that Master Rig has this quite detailed display showing me what's happening with the EQ balance. I particularly like the more slow-moving grey curve here that shows the general shape. It's easy to get distracted by the details in some of these displays. And again, I don't recommend choosing an EQ based on what a display like this shows you, but it can certainly be helpful. So the first thing that occurred to me listening to this song, it's already pretty balanced in terms of EQ, but I would like some more depth in that kick drum. And what I decided on was a boost of 1 dB at 60 Hertz. The 50 to 60 range is often where you find the deep thump in the kick drum. It's a valuable area to listen to. So let me just play you that section of the song with and without that boost so you can see the effect that it has. So you can hear it's very much down in the sub region of the kick. It's quite a subtle change, but it just adds a little bit of beef that I like. Immediately that I'd done that, I then felt like I needed more clarity and edge up in the high mids. And for that, I added, again, 1 dB. These are quite broad cues, both of them, but this time up at 3.5 kilohertz. So I'm going to play that for you. That has the nice effect of lifting that vocal out of the mix slightly, or seeming to. Remember I said we can't really EQ the vocal alone, but boosting in that region definitely seems to bring that vocal forward because it's the most prominent thing in the mix at that point. That works, but it's sounding a little bit hard, so I decided to try and sweeten things a little bit with a boost a little bit higher up. So then we've got just a half a dB at 7.4 kilohertz, and you can see those two frequency ranges kind of blend together a little bit, but they don't have the effect that it would have with a shelf if I'd applied that EQ all the way up, which would have lifted the very high frequencies as well. So let's just play that very subtle top end boost. The shadows give no hope. Can't pretend I'm not all alone. Don't need love, this I know. It's all promises and lies. So that's working nicely. Just kind of opens out the top end of the guitar in particular, interestingly enough, but also a little bit more in the top end of the vocals, and the cymbals and the overhead sound of the drums benefits from that as well. But here's where I got a bit tricky. Listening to that, I really felt that the guitars panned to the left and right would really benefit from a bit of extra beef. So I'm thinking of a kind of a low mid boost, but I was concerned that that might muddy up everything in the center of the mix, the low end of the vocals, the bass guitar and the snare in particular. And what I settled on was a boost in the sides only. It's a larger boost than the others. It's 2.5 dBs, again with a broad Q at 332 Hertz, so 330 Hertz. Let me just play that to you so you can hear the effect of it. Listen particularly for the effect on the guitars. So that's working really nicely. It adds some real muscle to those guitars, especially in the chugging sections there, but it doesn't get away. You know, you have that bass guitar with the sustained note in the center of the image. It doesn't muddle any of that stuff up or mess with the balance of the elements in the mix that are panned centrally. So that's the side signal, that's the difference signal, that's the stuff at the edges of the image. And if you have an EQ that enables you to do MS processing, it can be incredibly powerful at mastering. It's a Spider-Man process. With great power comes great responsibility. It's very easy to mess things up using mid-side processing, so I do recommend caution. But in this case, it's turned out to be just the thing. So those were the 4 EQ changes that I decided on for this track. Let me just show you how it sounds if I switch those in and out all at once. And I'm actually hearing, because all of those are boosts, the loudness seems to come up a little bit, so that could be fooling us a little bit. So let's take that down by, say, half a dB and try that again. And that's a subtle change, but not a subtle change. I think you'll agree, even with the level matched in that way, I'm hearing more clarity, more space, more depth, and also the extra muscle in those guitars is really valuable. And because I used a side boost to achieve that with the EQ, it's actually pulled those guitars out very slightly. So just broadened the image a little bit in that low mid-range, which actually I really quite like. I'm happy with the top end of the master, but yeah, I think overall that's a really beneficial change, and hopefully you agree. So let's move on to Another Day Calling. Again, I've used the Master Rig EQ, and you can see immediately it's a very different shaped curve, and that's an important point. There is no one size fits all when we're mastering. There are no magic adjustments that you can apply to any song to achieve a deep bass or sweet top end. It has to be fine-tuned individually for every song, even when you're working with the same album, the same artist, recorded and mixed in the same studio. Every song needs its own optimized settings. So again, I'll take you through these changes as I made them. Remember that the main thing I said that I wanted to do with this song was to warm up the EQ. I felt it sounded a little bit thin. And so I started with a low shelf boost here. That's everything down from about 380 Hertz being lifted by 1.7 dB. So let me play you some of that to start with. So that's filling out the low end of those strings nicely, beefing up the bass guitar. I'd still like a little bit more weight in the kick drum though. So I have another boost, this time 63 Hertz, similar frequency to last time, and a slightly bigger boost. We've got 1.6 dB. So let's listen to that. So I'm liking that, but I'm noticing something that I'm not so keen on. There's a slightly heartbeat quality to the kick drum, which is nice, but I feel is a little bit distracting in the low mids. And the adjustment that I came up with to address that was a reduction of 2.5 dBs with a slightly narrower Q, and that's coming in at about 260 Hertz. So let me just play that to you so you can hear how that sounds. So I think that's working quite well. Again, it's a subtle change, and if you're paying attention, you'll have noticed that in this case, I made that change in the mid section of the EQ only, rather than the side. I didn't want it to take away from the warmth of the strings. But speaking of the strings, I actually felt that it would be nice to get a little bit more warmth into them. I could have tweaked this original shelf setting, but since I have plenty of bands available to me in the EQ, I decided to go in with an extra boost instead. So I'll just play you some of that. You can hear how nicely that works, even with quite a small boost, like a dB at 345 Hertz, just fills out the bottom end of those strings nicely and just helps warm the whole texture up a little bit. Of course, it goes slightly against that cut that I had there for the slightly hooty sound in the kick drum, but overall they work well together. Having done all of that, I then felt that probably having warmed up this low end, I needed a little bit of clarity in the high end, so I added one final adjustment, which was an extra dB up at 3.6 kilohertz this time. Again, this is a really broad boost. You'll notice that I generally use broad boosts unless I want to do something particularly surgical, like this kind of mid-cut here. Let me play that and see how that sounds. Just opens out that top end nicely, a little bit more life in the drums, the top end of the voice. I think I'm pleased with how that's working. Let's try enabling and disabling the entire EQ setting. Bigger, warmer, fuller. I'm pleased with the way that it sounds. It sounds sweeter, sounding great. So finally we come to Widow. In this case, I'm using a slightly different EQ processor. It's still one of the ones that's included with Wavelab, and you can use any EQ you like. In this case, I used it because I wanted to do something slightly different with the compression, which I'm going to talk about in the next video. Again, a completely different curve. Just let me take you quickly through the changes. In fact, I don't think I need to go into these individually, My overall feeling for this song was that it was a little bit bright and hard sounding. So my first change was to reduce the upper mid slightly. Then I balanced that with a boost higher up at about 9 kilohertz to keep the top end open. Again, I wanted to beef up the kick drum slightly, and it sounded a little bit muddled in the low mids. So I reduced around 260 hertz by about a dB in this case. So I'll just show you how that sounds as I toggle those changes on and off. But you play with it. I don't want the street to claim your last sweet breath. Stay, babe, I know that it's a rush to do what you do. Stay, won't you stay with me? But I can make it up to you. Hopefully you can hear that. I think it sounds a little bit clearer, a little bit more open, with a little bit more punch. And that's what I feel worked musically for this song. So what I want to do now is just temporarily disable the EQ settings on all of these songs and let you hear how much difference there is as the songs balance each other. Remember, we're going for balance, not matching. And I'll just compare different sections of the songs as we did when we were listening to the loudness. First without the EQ changes, and then with. And then if I re-enable those EQ changes and we make the same comparison, and it's interesting as I listen to them because I wonder whether perhaps Widow is a little bit loud in comparison to the other two. But I think the main thing that jumped out to me was the extra warmth and body that we've got into Another Day Calling, which was the thing that I commented on when we were comparing the loudness. I feel that that matches and balances much better with the other two songs now. And all three songs, I think, sit together better next to each other. Those subtle little changes have just pulled them all closer together, which is exactly what we want from the mastering process. We'll leave the overall loudness decision on Widow to the next video where we're going to be looking at compression, because that will influence the way that we hear things. So now we've got a good balance in the EQ and the loudness between the three songs, and we're ready to move on to thinking about dynamics. All three songs have quite a full arrangement, so we've balanced them all to have a fairly even EQ response across the frequency spectrum. Let me just show you that. The analyzer displays are too broad to really home in generally, but you can see that we have a roughly even distribution of frequencies across the spectrum for all three songs, and that's a good goal to have in mind when you have a full arrangement like these. So there you go. Hopefully that was helpful or interesting and gives you an idea of the kind of things that I'm thinking about, the kind of goals that I have when I'm using EQ as part of the mastering process. Remember, the goal isn't to match the EQ between the songs. The goal is just to balance them. We don't want them to sound all the same, especially if we have different genres and styles and arrangements. We just want them to fit together to make a cohesive whole, to make a satisfying listening experience as you listen from one song to the next, or indeed if they're pulled out and turn up in a playlist somewhere online perhaps. Remember, you don't need to worry too much about the loudness because louder songs will be turned down by the online streaming services. We're going to come back to that topic again in a later video so that you know exactly what's going to happen there. So now we have the EQ balanced for the songs, but I was hearing some other differences in there, differences between the dynamics of the songs, the way that they were working. And that's going to require us to use some compression and limiting, which is what we're going to talk about in the next video. If you found these videos helpful or interesting, I think you'll also love the free PDF I've put together. It's called the Home Mastering Guide. It's very simple. It outlines the 6 steps that I think are essential to releasing your music with complete confidence. It walks you through and it makes a great companion to this series of videos. So if you would like to get your copy of that, head over to homemasteringguide.com. It's completely free and you may like it. Remember also to subscribe to this channel, to the Sound on Sound channel, to get the rest of this video series and the other great content that they're sharing here. My name is Ian Shepherd. Thanks for listening.